If you really want to understand the darkest regimes of the 20th century, I'm talking about Nazi Germany, Stalinist Russia, we can't just start in the 1930s.
No, you can't.
Hannah Arendt argues we have to trace their logic all the way back to the systemic failures of the 19th century European state.
That's the core of her argument.
So the question is, what complex historical currents, what chilling political inventions really came together to create these forms of total domination? And for this deep dive, we want you to discover a new, in-depth approach to book coverage with this extended summary.
That's right.
Unlike our previous review, which offers a more focused analysis, this feature delivers a comprehensive overview. We're tracing the intellectual roots, the key arguments, and the real-world impact of this subject.
We'd love to know what you think.
Absolutely. If you appreciate this expanded format and find it helpful, please let us know. Your feedback is going to help shape future content.
So today, we're diving into Arendt's monumental work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which was first published back in 1951.
A landmark book.
It really is. It's a work of political theory and intellectual history that fundamentally reframed how we understand 20th century tyranny.
And her mission, as I see it, is to show that totalitarianism is a novel form of rule.
Yes, completely new. It's distinct from simple despotism or dictatorship because it relies on an all-encompassing ideology and systematic terror.
And that terror is directed at entire populations, not just, say, political opponents.
Exactly.
And you're experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book summaries.
So to frame this, Arendt argues that the backdrop to all these events is the collapse of traditional class structures and really the crisis of the nation-state itself.
Okay.
And this crisis created a large, politically isolated population, she calls them the masses, who were just ready to be recruited into these radical ideological movements.
All right, let's unpack that first stage then. Anti-Semitism. Arendt makes this critical distinction that's easy to miss. Modern political anti-Semitism wasn't just old-fashioned religious hatred.
Not at all.
So why does she insist this was a necessary structural tool unique to the 19th century?
Well, the difference really lies in its function and its scale. Before this, anti-Jewish sentiment was often religious or, social prejudice.
Right.
But modern anti-Semitism, Arendt argues, became a political ideology. It provided a kind of universal explanation for why society was collapsing.
And to get that, you have to understand the very specific position European Jews held at the time.
Exactly. Historically, Jewish communities often served as financiers and intermediaries for state administration, especially in international finance.
So they were essential to the state, but at the same time, sort of outside the social fabric.
Precisely. They were a kind of stateless element tied only to the central state authority. So when the national economy and the nation-state itself started to fail, that relationship turned toxic.
So they became linked with this opaque state power and financial influence, but they didn't have the political protection that came with full citizenship.
A very dangerous position to be in. They were seen as immensely powerful, the hidden hand pulling the strings, but also socially separate.
The perfect target.
The perfect symbolic target. As the old class system fell apart, these new mass political movements needed a simple, global explanation for everyone's grievances. Anti-Semitism gave them that narrative.
So it moves from just social anti-Semitism, simple prejudice, to political anti-Semitism.
Yes, an organized program. One designed to strip away rights, citizenship, and eventually life. The Dreyfus Affair in France is a stunning example of this in action.
Right, at the turn of the century.
It wasn't just about one wrongfully accused army officer. It showed how easily anti-Semitism could become the focal point for a much broader attack on Republican institutions, on Parliament itself.
It became a tool to rally people.
A powerful one. It demonstrated how conspiracy theories, fueled by the press, could mobilize all these different resentful groups, monarchists, radical nationalists, the displaced middle classes, and unite them against an imagined hidden enemy.
It proved that the political use of a scapegoat could just steamroll truth, law, everything. So if anti-Semitism provided the ideological template, Arendt then moves to part 2, imperialism. This, she says, provided the operational template. This is where the method of lawless administration is born. We're talking about new imperialism from the 1880s to World War I. What was the main driver?
The engine, Arendt argues, was the buildup of what she calls superfluous capital in Europe. Domestic markets were saturated, that capital couldn't find profitable investments at home.
So the money had to go somewhere else.
It had to move outward, and that drove the frantic expansion into Africa and other regions. But this outward movement, it fundamentally changed the nature of the state back home.
How so? I mean, how does chasing profits in Central Africa dismantle the rule of law in Central Europe?
Because the territories they seized were completely outside the existing European legal order. You couldn't use the Constitution to rule them.
So they had to improvise.
They had to invent new forms of arbitrary rule. Lawlessness became the administrative norm in the colonies, which of course led to brutal, unchecked violence.
And this colonial context is where Arendt argues modern political racism really develops into a necessary ideology.
Absolutely. The doctrine of a strict racial hierarchy became the essential tool to justify dominating colonized peoples. She looks at the Boers during the Great Trek in southern Africa, for instance. She details how racial thinking became institutionalized to organize society and justify that violence. And here's her crucial point. These methods, these doctrines, they didn't stay in the colonies.
They were imported back home.
They were imported back into European political life. That's the feedback loop.
A terrifying precedent. The idea that a state could just operate without any constitutional rules, deciding who's human and who's disposable.
And while that's happening overseas, she notes that similar anti-constitutional forces were at work within Europe, what she calls continental imperialism.
Pan-Germanism, pan-Slavism.
Right. And unlike overseas imperialism, which was mostly economic, these were driven by ideology and race. They rejected traditional states, they rejected parliaments, they defined themselves as movements.
Demanding total loyalty.
Total, permanent loyalty. They wanted to replace the whole pluralistic structure of the nation-state with a single racial destiny.
Okay, so we've got the ideological weapon with anti-Semitism and the operational blueprint with imperialism.
Yeah.
That leads to the critical transformation, the fuel for the fire, how stable classes turn into isolated masses.
This is the final essential step. When stable social and political structures, parties, unions, churches, when they disintegrated, huge numbers of people became politically detached, isolated.
They felt redundant.
Exactly. And Arendt says this isolation made them psychologically vulnerable, available for recruitment into radical movements. These were people disconnected from others, feeling superfluous and just ripe for a movement that promised them a sweeping sense of belonging and a total fixed purpose. At the midpoint of your learning journey, you can also look to Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques that encourage reflection and rational thought and is valuable for aspiring authors.
So if imperialism showed how the state could operate lawlessly abroad, the creation of these masses showed the domestic social forces that made that lawlessness acceptable at home.
Yes. And that brings us to part 3. Totalitarianism.
The fully developed cases.
Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. She stresses again that they are novel forms of government, seeking to dominate all aspects of human life, not just political behavior.
They weren't just trying to rule, they were trying to organize millions of people into a single obedient thing.
Operating under a single overarching logic. Which brings us to the dual core of it all, ideology and terror.
Let's break that down. If ideology is the logic, what is terror's exact function? Because it's chillingly abstract.
The ideology, whether it's the so-called law of nature for Nazism or the law of history for Stalinism, is a complete logical system. It interprets everything and claims to predict the future.
Infallible.
Right. The purpose of terror, then, is to enforce that system's logic against any perceived human reality, any deviation.
So if the ideology says a certain group is historically obsolete, terror makes that a reality by eliminating the group.
Exactly. Regardless of what they have actually done or think, terror ensures that human reality conforms to the ideological fiction. It's systematic, unpredictable, and often directed at people who are completely innocent of any crime.
That requires a massive internal organization. How do these movements structure themselves to maintain that constant state of motion and terror?
They rely on an infallible leader, the person who is the conduit of the ideology, and a constantly shifting, often overlapping, party hierarchy.
To keep everyone off balance.
Yes, in perpetual motion, totally dependent on the leader. Propaganda is for the outside world, simplifying the narrative. But inwardly, it's deep organizational discipline and terror that control everyone, eliminating the very idea of a private life.
Which goes back to her point about isolation. The regime exploits the loneliness that already exists.
It becomes a precondition. Loneliness and isolation are essential. because a person disconnected from others has nowhere to retreat and no shared reality to check against the ideological fiction.
And the ultimate culmination of all of this, the central institution where terror and ideology are tested to their extreme, is the concentration camp system. Why does Arendt call the camps the laboratory?
She calls them the laboratory because they are the testing ground for the ultimate totalitarian claim, the possibility of total human domination.
To see if it can actually be done.
To see if everything about a person, their spontaneity, their morality, their uniqueness can be erased. To prove that human beings can be made utterly superfluous and interchangeable. It's where the ideology tries to eliminate unpredictability itself.
That is just a staggering takeaway. If we synthesize Arendt's entire path, you see the clear line. Antisemitism created the unifying ideological weapon.
Imperialism provided the structural laboratory for lawless rule.
And the crisis of the nation-state provided the isolated available population, the superfluous people.
And that leads to her most enduring themes, which are still so relevant, the problem of statelessness and what she famously called the right to have rights.
The fundamental need to belong to a political community.
Yes, a community that recognizes and protects you. To lose that, to become superfluous in the eyes of the state, is to lose the very capacity to be human.
And it gives you such profound context for current crises. I mean, think about the constant contrast Arendt draws between legal constitutional government, which has to accommodate human unpredictability, and a political system that seeks, through this crushing ideological logic, to erase those very qualities. That struggle, she implies, is always present.
The Origins of Totalitarianism it's remained a foundational text ever since it was published, a definitive early analysis. It's a classic study, and its arguments on ideology and terror are constantly debated by political thinkers today.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book critique. Subscribe, share, consider purchasing the book via the provided link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.